All right.
Hello, everyone. Oh, wait, can everyone hear? Beautiful. Hello, everyone. Wanted to start off with a thank you to all of our panelists, our moderators, our keynotes, the wonderful Kroc Institute, Anna, who's back there. Can't see her, but oh, there we go. Yeah. All of the wonderful attendees that we have in the audience and virtually back home. Thank you for coming and making this what it is. We're really excited to see what this amazing 2022 Peace Conference will be. Yeah, anyways, so we're going to do some brief introductions. We are the 2022 Peace Conference planning co-chairs. My name is Dane Sherman, and I'm a sophomore from Seattle, Washington. I am studying American Studies, Peace Studies with a minor in Gender Studies, and besides being on this amazing conference co-chair team, have been involved in a lot of justice work, and I'm really interested in the intersections between religion, gender relations work, and all of those amazing things, and I've done a lot of work within student advocacy here on campus, from being the director of university policy and student government, the historian for PRISM, and the editor-in-chief of a collection, like an anthology called LGBTQ Domers. I'm really excited to see all of these fantastic presentations, and yeah.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Francesca Masciopinto, and I'm a sophomore from Madison, Wisconsin, studying peace studies and political science with a minor in digital marketing. Besides this wonderful conference, my extracurricular activities include running social media for a small sustainability nonprofit called PAC Collective, writing blogs and articles for Strike Magazine, and my role as social captain for Barakabouts, which is our women's boxing club here on campus. Joining this organizing committee has been an incredible way to get more involved in the Kroc Institute this year, and it has really made me feel like a true part of the Peace Studies community. I'm incredibly grateful for all the hard work that my fellow co-chairs and our advisor, Anna, have put into this project. It's so important to make space for student voices in the academic community. I'm proud to contribute to a conference that creates that opportunity.
Hi, my name is Khya Morton. I'm a sophomore studying political science and peace studies here at Notre Dame. Outside of this conference, I'm involved in a few cultural clubs here on campus, including the Shades of Ebony organization and the Black Student Association. I'm also a student office assistant here at the Hesburgh Center and a research assistant to Professor Ernesto Verdeja through the Kellogg International Scholars Program. One of my favorite things about being on this year's steering committee has definitely been getting the opportunity to work with my amazing committee members and our advisor, Ms. Anna. We've worked really hard to put this conference together over the past 7 months, and I'm really excited to see what our presenters have in store for us this weekend.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Orlando. I'm also a sophomore, like everyone else on the committee. I'm primarily studying management consulting through the Mendoza School of Business, but I also have minors in peace studies and Italian. Other than planning this conference, you can find me at Haggerty Cafe. I'm the student manager over there. Or you can find me at the Gender Relations Center doing event planning for healthy relationships, LGBTQ plus issues, and gender issues as well. Or the last place you can find me is on my computer doing remote work for this firm called Juve Consulting. We do Gen Z marketing and consulting work. Admittedly, I joined the conference a bit late, but I cannot thank Khya, Frankie, Dane, and Anna up there enough for opening their arms and hearts to me throughout this process. I wanted to explore my interest in the intersection of business and global peace movements, as well as facilitate a space for student voices to be heard as they deserve to be. The planning process has allowed me to do just that. I'd like to invite Frankie back to tell you guys a little bit about why we chose our theme.
So this conference is by students, for students, and it creates a space for open dialogue on important peace studies issues, as well as a space for young academics to share their hard work. For 2022, we wanted to address the theme of justice as it serves as a foundational pillar for understanding what peace means in different contexts. This definition of justice in peace studies extends far beyond the word's common usage, as our discipline dives far beyond the surface level of peace-building issues. Our theme, Reimagining Justice, comes from this depth of understanding and a drive to explore new intersectional lenses of peace studies. We wanted to emphasize that justice is not just a linear process, but rather a circular one that goes through many iterations. Justice cannot be defined by one general idea. It is entirely dependent on those who seek it and the matter in which they seek it. As a committee, we've selected keynotes and presenters that reflect nuanced and innovative perspectives of justice in their work. Hopefully, this conference will help us all reimagine what justice truly means.
Before we officially begin this year's Student Peace Conference, we would like to offer a few words of wisdom to our virtual and in-person participants to get the most out of your conference experience. First, we highly recommend that you take advantage of the Socio platform and all of its interactive aspects, including the chat wall, event games, and networking features. This is a great opportunity to connect with other participants and presenters throughout the weekend, whether you're in person or virtual. Second, we encourage you to approach each panel session and/or talk with an open mind and an open heart. We understand that a few presentation topics might be uncomfortable for some participants. However, this conference is a safe space to engage in respectful and constructive dialogue with individuals from diverse backgrounds. Lastly, to our in-person participants, you're welcome to sit in C102 with your laptops and participate in this conference virtually as well. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to find one of the committee members or Ms. Anna. And for our virtual participants, you can email the Peace Conference account, peacecon@nd.edu, and we'll respond to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, and lastly, I was given the opportunity to introduce our keynote for today, Dr. David Anderson Hooker. The Peace Conference Committee extends our gratitude and thanks to you for joining us today. For those of you who don't already know him, Dr. Hooker is the founder and principal narrator for CounterStories Consulting, which engages in international, national, and local civil society organizations, religious groups, organization leaders, and social entrepreneurs to craft narratives of their preferred futures and align organizational structures and internal practices in furtherance of their constructed narratives. He is the founding member of the Board of Directors for the Chicago Torture Justice Center, where he's helping to develop both theory and practice of politicized healing as a new articulation of justice. The Joan B. Kroc Institute was lucky enough to have him on their faculty from 2016 to 2021, where they were privy to his immense expertise in conflict transformation and peace building. Above all else, he continuously utilizes his training and expertise in conflict transformation by serving as a mediator, restorative circle steward, facilitator, community builder, scholar, and advocate. I was one such student who got to interact with Professor Hooker last spring. Just short of a year ago, he presented as a guest speaker in my Introduction to Peace Studies course. While the class may have brought along some uncomfortable feelings, Professor Hooker successfully confronted us with the truths of our own contributions and privilege in the system of whiteness. I followed up with him after class for some advice about an essay I had for my USM. I asked him how we can best focus on the structural implications of white privilege, to which he responded with more food for thought. He replied saying, "How can we build narratives that more equitably distribute social power? How can people become more aware of the ways that they have excess social power based on fictional and socially constructed narratives?" These are questions that I still think of and reflect on today. I invite you all to listen with an open mind, ask yourself questions, and challenge yourself to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I hope that you can embrace his words so that you too may reimagine justice. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Hooker to the stage to deliver his keynote. Thank you.
Modern scholars of memory work have disabused us of the old notion about the way that memory works. We used to think that memory was something that it was like a cassette. Many of you are too young to understand cassette as a concept, but cassette or DVD, or it was a link or something like this where every time you hit it, it played back exactly the same way. And it had the same form, it had the same features, it had the same tenor, it had the same tone. What scholars now tell us is that memory is reconstructed every time you call it up. Particularly when that memory had traumagenic components to it. If there was trauma, then it was hard to process at the time, and so you didn't necessarily observe all of the nuanced features of what was happening. And then later on, when you call the memory up, you call it up and you remember it in a way that's aligned with the narrative or the context for which you need it in the moment. So you call up the memory and you may add additional details or add some salience to those details or emphasize or de-emphasize certain details of the memory just to fit the current context in which it's being used. All of that is to say that this memory that I want to share with you as the basis for our consideration of reimagining justice may have some features that have been reimagined, added in order to make it fit with the context of our conversation today. Just please allow that all memories are designed for the context in which they're given, right? The context in which they're called up. And so for reimagining justice, imagining or reimagining justice, I want to share a memory with you. When I was 13 years old, I got my first job, right? And I was working at KAM Supret. Calvin Alvin Moore had a little local supermarket, so it was the KAM Supret. And I loved, this was a job, like it wasn't my first work. Like, you know, I've cut lawns before and cleaned out garages and shoveled snow, but for those, the thing about that kind of work is you get paid immediately. A job happens when you have to trust that the people for whom you are doing the work will at some point in the distant future, not too distant future, hopefully, remunerate you for your work, right? That's when it's a job. I had my first job when I was 13 years old, and the job was, the Supret was in a neighborhood other than where I lived, and so in order to get there, I had to actually catch a bus, not my neighborhood bus, but catch a bus into another neighborhood with kids who sometimes, you know, back in the day, our neighborhoods beefed, but I would catch this other bus, and so I made friends with a lot of those folks. The value of the job for me was to have my own money. The purpose of having my own money was so that I didn't have to ask for permission. Like when my siblings asked for permission to go to the movies, it was assumed that they were also asking for money. Like, Mom, can I go to the movies? Meant, Mom, can I have $20 to go to the movies? And the wonderful thing is your parents don't necessarily have to deny you going to the movies. They can just say, I don't have the money, right? I didn't have to ask. I have my own money, so I don't have to ask for permission. I can just say, Mom, Mark and I are going to the movies, and when we come back, on the way back, we're going to Dairy Queen. Anyway, so I had my own job. I had my own money. And one of my goals, one of my earliest goals was to have a bike. I wanted to buy a bike, and I had been looking at a particular bike, and my parents thought the bike was too expensive, that I shouldn't have this bike. If I was going to have a bike at all, I shouldn't have that bike because it was too expensive. But guess what? I had my own money, and so it was just a suggestion that they were making. It was an idea, and I could say, thank you for sharing, right? Thank you for sharing. That's your idea. I want the bike. And so I bought a beautiful, right now it would be considered a classic, 10-speed, Schwinn Continental, solid blue body, racing handlebars, and I had it customized so that I had blue and silver reflective stripes, alternating blue and silver reflective stripes. Oh, God. I had my bike, and I would ride. I wouldn't ride it like to places like school or to work, but I just have it in the neighborhood, and you know, if I wanted to go to see Mark or my Auntie Pearl, I would go, I have my bike. And I would lean, at the end of the day, I would lean it either against the backboard, the pole for the basketball goal in the back of the yard, or against the garage. Had the bike for about 3 months and woke up one morning and noticed that it wasn't in the backyard. And I didn't think that much about it because usually if my mother leaves the house before I do, she would move it. If I had leaned it against the garage, she would just move it. And then when she pulls the car out of the garage, she would put the bike in the garage and take off. So I didn't notice it. I went to school, I went to work, I came home, I got up the next morning, I went to the garage, I didn't have a bike, and I was quite distraught. And there was nothing I could do because I didn't have a bike, right? But I didn't know what had happened to it, and nobody else seemed to know what had happened to it. About 3 weeks later, it's possible that I had said something smart to one of the teachers who invited me to stay after school for detention, right? And so what happens though with detention is because I can't get on the bike, the bus that would take me to the neighborhood where work is, I would have to walk home. And so, because walking to work was way too far, so I'm walking home. The elementary school where I went to school, North Avondale, is about halfway between high school and home. And I'm passing by the elementary school and I noticed a kid, Reuben, who lived about 3 doors down from me. And he was riding a bike, a Schwinn, 10-speed, solid blue with interesting blue and silver reflective stripe on the handlebars. And I wondered where he got the bike, and so I went over to ask him about it, and so he was trying to ride away from me. I was able to catch up with him, and we were talking about it. And the principal in the school came out and separated us because our conversation was probably, a little embodied, I would say. And the principal said, I've never seen you ride this bike. I've seen Reuben ride this bike in this playground. This must be his bike. And she sent me home. And she said she would call my mother. She knew my mother because my mother used to teach at that elementary school before she went to be a principal at another school. So I went home, I explained to my mother, Miss Freeman's gonna call you to tell you why, and whatever. That evening though, I went down the street to Reuben's house to explain to his father that I had seen Reuben riding a bike that looked just like the one that was missing from my house. And his father said, I don't know anything about a bike. Okay, that's fine. Well, so I couldn't, at the time, there was no way to recover the bike, and I actually never saw Reuben ride the bike in the neighborhood, only other places. I saw him ride at other places, other times, but never in the neighborhood. Turns out, and this might have been my first effort at retributive justice, the neighborhood basketball court was in my backyard. And so I could ban Reuben from playing basketball. Like, there are a lot of things you can do, but you can't come up in here playing basketball, right? And I tell you how much we had to sacrifice to make that happen. We let Danny Clemens, who was one of the youngest, smallest, most awkward kids in the block, finally get a shot. So Danny was in the game, but we would much rather have Danny in the game, I would, than have Reuben play. Anyway, so stay with me because I'm actually talking about justice, and I hope you all are pointing and looking for justice questions and imagining justice in this conversation, because this really is a question about justice. So at the end of that school year, Reuben's family moved away. I don't know where they went. Sorry to know, I don't know where they went. So Reuben's family moved away, and a couple of weeks later, another family, the Stanleys, moved in. If you don't hear anything else from this story, know this. I love Tommy Stanley, right? I love Tommy Stanley. We were friends forever. I haven't seen him in 20 years, but I love Tommy Stanley. The Stanleys moved in, and Tommy, who's a couple months younger than me, was going around to introduce himself to other kids in the neighborhood, and he was riding a bike, a Schwinn Continental, solid blue body, racing bar handles with the alternating silver and blue stripe, and he was riding this bike. So I went down to introduce myself to Tommy's parents, and I said, hi, you don't know this, but the guy who lived in this house before you all, the kid who lived here before, actually stole my bike, which looks exactly like that one. And Tommy's father said, I don't know about that, but when the bike was in the garage when we bought the house, I promised Thomas that he could have the bike. Okay. It took about a year and a half before I could let Tommy come and play basketball in my yard. But Tommy and I eventually became good friends. We traded James Brown records with Beatles records. He thought that James Brown was a better musician than the Beatles. We went back and forth on that. Anyway, the story, we're still talking about justice. I need you to know this is a conversation about justice. What happens with injustice is injustices often create compounding sets of advantages and disadvantages that go far beyond the original impact. Let me show you what I mean. That summer, Ruben's family moved out, the Stanleys moved in, Tommy had the bike. Jimmy Whiteside, who lived 2 doors down from Tommy, graduated. He was going off to the Ohio State University to go to college, and so he gave up his paper route. Now, the thing about having a paper route is you have to have a reliable form of transportation that goes beyond just your ability to walk, because the route is too large, right? And so I didn't have a bike, and so I wasn't even eligible. It could be, truth, all things being equal, I may not have gotten the paper route. But because I didn't have a bike, I had lost the fruits of my labor, lost the benefits of the fruits of my own labor, so I didn't have access to that, so Tommy could get the paper route. Let me tell you why that matters. 2 ways that matters that were really significant for competing and compounding injustices. If you have a bike and you can do a paper route, that means you can work in the morning and you can still participate in after-school activities. If you have to work and you don't have a bike and you can't work in the morning, you can't participate in after-school activities. And so at the end of the time that you're in high school, when your college guidance counselor looks at your record, because they don't actually know you, they just look at your record, they say, well, you've never done anything with your life, right? You come to school, you have good grades, but so what? Maybe you're not really disciplined enough to go to school, which is exactly what my college guidance counselor told me. The other thing, and if you can do theater and athletics and things like that, you can get exposed to recruiters, because recruiters don't look at the rec league. They don't pay attention. Even if you're a superstar in the church league or the rec league, they don't go to look at that kind of stuff. So that's one thing. But the other thing that was really, really, really insidious about the way that advantages compound and disadvantages compound is that if you're having a paper route back in the day, every month or every quarter, you would go to each house to collect money for the paper, right? And so when you're doing that, you get exposed. And so you get to talk once a month or once a quarter to Dr. Hawkins, to Dr. Crawley, to Judge Means, to Miss Lemon, the woman who owned one of the stores and shops. You get to talk to these people. And so when it's time to go to college, you actually can get a recommendation. Mr. Moore, the guy who I worked for, it doesn't matter that he can say that I am an honorable person, that I work hard, that I've got integrity, that I will go out of my way to help elderly people, that I always show up, that I do my work, he can say all of that, but because he's got a 9th grade education, nobody on an admissions committee cares anything about what Mr. Moore has to say. But Dr. Hawkins and Judge Means and Judge Crawley, Dr. Crawley, can write a letter. Tommy was nice when he collected the paper money, and that's sufficient for people to pay attention to them because they actually have a degree and people think that what they do. And so the injustice compounds in a variety of ways. Are we still talking about justice? Because I could be talking about a bike, and I could also be talking about the advantages and disadvantages that compound from stolen land. Even when we make an acknowledgement that this is land that has been used for education for all these many years and that was somehow given to the university, it was taken from indigenous people. I could be talking about that, but I'm talking about a bike so that I can keep it actually simple, so that we can keep the justice claim simple. I could be talking about the possibility that there were Africans that were stolen from their land who were brought and then had their labor extracted and were never compensated for 300 years of uncompensated labor and then thrown out into a space of freedom without any of the benefits of either their labor or their inventions. But that gets too complex, and so let's talk about a bike. the compounding advantages and disadvantages that justice creates are really important. And what makes it more difficult to address them and to reimagine justice is that most of us have what I would call a negative epistemology of justice. A negative epistemology of justice. You don't miss your water till the well runs dry. The mountain is clearer from the plain, right? Bobby Womack, if you think you're lonely now, wait until tonight. We have a negative epistemology of justice, which is to say we don't know what justice is, but we recognize it when it's absent. We recognize it primarily in its absence. But because we don't have a shared understanding of justice, there's no essence to justice. I said this a slightly different way in another context. I said that justice is neither boat nor barbecue. Let me make sure you guys get this. Justice is neither boat nor barbecue. If I say boat, we may not necessarily immediately imagine the same thing. Some might think yacht, sailboat, dinghy, kayak, whatever, but we all have a similar understanding of the essence of boatness, a vessel that is designed to carry above water, to convey people or cargo or something else above water for the water conditions. And so a kayak does better in certain conditions. A raft, a sailboat, a yacht, they all do better in different conditions, but we all have a sense, there's an essence of boatness. There is no essence of justice. We don't all share. If I ask two people to describe a time where they experienced justice, they may describe very different things and not necessarily agree with the other about what constitutes justice. Justice is, Ferdinand de Saussure, the linguist, would say, it's an ineffective signifier. Signifier. If I use a sound or a symbol of some sort, that's the signifier, and then it should reference something that is signified. It should point to something that's signified. And when the signifier and the signified actually always align well, then we have a sign. So if you see, we're at the Kroc Institute, if you see golden arches, right, there is a symbol, an indicator, a signifier of the presence of really bad food that is not good for your heart, right? But it's a clear connection, right? It's an effective signifier. If I say justice, it's an ineffective signifier because it doesn't call the same thing to our minds. Justice doesn't have the essence of boatness. It's not like a boat. It's also not like barbecue. A lot of times when we think about barbecue, there are three ways that you can imagine barbecue. Barbecue is either product, it's the thing that comes off the grill, assuming it had parents. It's not, if you put asparagus and corn and root vegetables on a grill and take them off, it is not barbecue, right? So, assuming it had parents to begin with, if you put it on a grill and take it off, it qualifies as barbecue. So barbecue could be product, it could be process, the actual process of creating, doing the grilling, or it could be the social space. It could be the context. Sometimes when people talk about justice, they talk about the product. Justice was served, justice was not served. They talk about the process, they're not doing justice, or they talk about the space, the social context. But because we don't all talk about all those things the same way, it's still nebulous as to what we're trying to produce, what we're trying to create, so it's an ineffective signifier. So how do we imagine or reimagine justice? Okay. I should have paid attention to my notes. We're still talking about justice. So in the story about the bike, where do you look for the possibilities for justice? The principal could have acting in a space of no knowledge, of limited knowledge, just from her own, limited, narrow perspective. She could have chosen to expand the exploration to determine if there are other ways other than the way she thought about it, to determine the ownership of the bike. Ruben's parents could have looked. My parents could have participated in the reacquisition of the bike. Maybe justice was happening when the bike got stolen. Maybe justice is about that karmic comeuppance, like, I shouldn't have been such a smart aleck when my parents said, you don't need a bike, and maybe that was the first effort at justice. Is justice about truth, expanded knowledge, personal accountability? Must justice require accountability? That's a question that I want to pose to us, because if justice requires accountability, then once Ruben's family is gone and the Stanleys have moved in and Tommy has the bike, what accountability is there? You should ask yourselves, what accountability do we have? We have been given the vehicles of access to participate in the compounding advantages and disadvantages of a system we didn't set up. Being at Notre Dame, that is you're on that bike. You are Tommy Stanley on the bike. Do you have any responsibility for undoing or for mitigating the compounding series of advantages and disadvantages that you are now benefiting from? Is that a reasonable request? And if so, is it still in the framework of justice? Or is there something else? Are we beyond the question of justice? Most of the time when we look in the biking scenario and we look at personal accountability, and that personal accountability and personal form of justice sit inside the dominant Western narrative of individualism, and everybody has rights and access, and you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and nobody looks to notice what is there about a system that's set up that 12 and 13-year-old children think that they have to go to work and enter the labor market in order to help their families have stability. Is that a justice question, or is that something else? What is it about the way that the world works that education is so accessible only to those who have certain kinds of resources or are in certain networks, so that even at a young age you start having the anxiety associated with being able to get access to the kinds of support and development that are going to allow you to fully flourish? Is that a justice question, or is that something else? Right? Because what is it about the situation where, based on the place where you live, where Tommy lived 3 doors down from me, because of his address, he had access to resources and networks that I don't have access to? It turns out that most of us lived and we were raised in communities where some of us were in the neighborhoods that had full access, and some of us were in the neighborhoods that didn't have access, but it was because of where we lived. Our zip code determines the likelihood of your full flourishing. Is that a justice question? If so, then what we were watching on that street, on West Park Drive, just in that moment, is a microcosm of a larger question, and why all of that. But we rarely look there when we're trying to figure out justice, because we have a narrative of truth and personal accountability. There's also this problem with justice. This is one of the chief problems that we have reimagining justice, which is this notion of supersession. Do you guys know what the supersessionary argument is? Injustice creates a status quo. It stabilizes into a new status quo. When people have become accustomed to the new status quo, if your claim for justice would disrupt the status quo that too many others have become accustomed to, then we say that their current condition supersedes your demand for justice. It's the supersessionary argument as to why the indigenous folks in Australia and New Zealand won't get their land back. We apologize to them. We give them a whole sorry day. We give them all kinds of other rituals, but we're not giving them their land back because it would disrupt the lives of 5 generations of settler colonialists who have now become accustomed to being able to extract and exploit their land, regardless of, even though we know, we are aware, it's not a truth argument anymore. We are clearly aware of the truth over time. We can trace that truth over time. But your demand for justice is superseded by our comfort in the current injustice system. That's a problem when you're trying to reimagine justice. So it turns out that for what most of us want, when you talk about gender justice, racial justice, social justice, environmental justice, if justice is confused with notions of process, intervention, and accountability and truth-telling, then most of us will always be unsatisfied with the work that's being done. Point of personal privilege, you all invited me back. I appreciate you all inviting me back. Thank you so much for inviting me back. This is not completely, directly, totally, only about Notre Dame. Not completely. There was a request to establish an effort towards racial justice, which became a committee and a process about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I promise you that justice has nothing to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are about incorporating us into a process where we haven't previously been incorporated, but the systems and the structures of injustice will supersede your participation. You are allowed to participate. We're not changing the system. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Justice is about creating a completely different narrative that creates the space where everybody can fully flourish. Often what we call justice is creating space, allowance, minor modifications for accommodation. In his text, I'll actually read this because this is helpful. In his text, Return to the Teachings, Rupert Ross was talking about justice. He was really talking about the roots of the indigenous roots of restorative justice. And he describes what Westerners think of justice as an intervention. But he says justice involves much more than what you do after things have gone wrong. Instead, it involves creating the social conditions that minimize such wrongdoing. A strong and healthy community becomes a bedrock in which justice can be done and in which justice becomes unnecessary. Robert Yazzie, who is the retired, he was the former Chief Justice of the Dene Nation Supreme Court. He says that, I always say that America responds to crime after the fact, not before the fact. Therefore, most of the justice work done in the Navajo Dene Nation is rooted in prevention, meant to maintain harmony and balance in community. If we follow what Rupert Ross, Chief Justice Yazzie, or my friend Sujatha Baliga have said over and over again, they say that on balance, imagining community is much more important than imagining justice. Imagining community is much more important for preventing violence, preventing inequity and harm, than imagining justice processes to repair the harm. We're familiar with retributive justice, we're familiar with restorative justice, and generally neither of them work to undo the system structures, the narratives that have produced the harm and are likely to continue to produce the harm. And so we have to do something else. We have to imagine, if we're going to approach justice, we have to imagine creating a world where justice as an intervention becomes unnecessary. And so I want to tell you a second story about how and where we're doing that, or where we're at least trying to do that. Between 1972 and 1991, hundreds of black and brown-bodied men on the south side of Chicago were kidnapped, tortured, and forced to confess, sometimes to crimes that they have committed and often to crimes that they had not committed. And if they didn't confess to a crime, they were invited to to give false testimony against somebody else. We know that there are hundreds that were placed in prison for sentences ranging from 5 years to the death penalty for crimes that were extracted, and they were prosecuted and convicted based on confessions that were extracted by torture. What do I mean torture? Being hit in the head with phone books, having electric cattle prod stuck in your genitals, having mock execution, pulling a shotgun to the side of your head, revolver to the side of your head, keeping you in a black box away from all contact for weeks at a time before they would cause you to confess. All of this torture was being done by, in theory, a rogue unit of the police under the guidance of Commander John Burge. The problem was the people who were connected to the people who were being tortured, black and brown-bodied women, mostly poor, aunts, mothers, wives, daughters, working-class folks, were telling people about it, and nobody would listen. They lacked testimonial authority to have their concerns addressed by a city or federal government. It actually wasn't until a guy from the Guardian newspaper was writing an article about Guantanamo Bay and noticed how many former Guantanamo soldiers were being recruited to the Chicago Police Department, that he got some indication of what was happening. And when he pointed it out, people began to be willing to listen. A lot of advocacy, and on May 6th, 2015, the Chicago City Council finally passed a reparations ordinance to establish the Chicago Torture Justice Center. I'm glad to be a member of the board of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. All of the people who have been impacted by those forms of justice, they had restorative justice while they were in prison. They had healing justice while they were in prison. They experienced retributive justice. They got reparations. They realized that justice was not the thing that was going to produce the life or the world that they wanted. And so we set about trying to create something new and different and not describe it as justice. And so what we've been pursuing is a thing that's called politicized healing. Politicized healing is our belief that our healing is political and that politics, being engaged in politics, is in fact healing. Politicized healing addresses the harm felt by individuals and communities caused by historic and evolving systems of oppression. We have three moves. There are three components to the work of politicized healing. There's the heal, which means to engage in a self-determined process of restoring ourselves and connecting to others and what we care about. There's dismantle, which is unapologetically exposing and deconstructing systems of harm. And then there is create, building reparative power, creating new paradigms, creating systems that are separate and distinct from the current power systems in order to have the space within which we can fully flourish. And without describing them completely, we have a set of values that we operate in: holistic support, community relations, politicized healing, liberatory culture, transformational leadership, and radical justice. And so we're trying to imagine a world where justice interventions become less necessary because harm has been addressed and harm has been prevented, and the potential for recurring advantage and disadvantages have been mitigated. So I started off talking about this boat, this barbecue piece, and the fact that justice is an ineffective signifier. The reason this is important is because Justice is something that has to be co-created. It has to be co-constructed, which means we have to have some agreement about what it is that we're building. And there seem to be three, in addition to the lack of language, the lack of signification, there seem to be three things that are impediments to imagining a world in which justice becomes less necessary. The need for justice interventions becomes obviated. The three things are imagination, and imagination, which includes language, which really much includes language, intransigence, which may actually be part of imagination, but I would describe it slightly differently, and our identities. Imagination. Even people who have severely suffered under the current systems have trouble imagining a different system. And Angela Davis reminds us all the time that we have to do more than talk about liberating society. We have to talk about liberating minds. We have to be willing and able to act as if radical transformation of society is possible. We have to do it all the time, and we have to do that based on an imagination, not in the pillars of injustice that we face every day. So that's our lack of imagination. Our intransigence is how we deal with supersessionary claims. Very few of us are willing to imagine a world that doesn't involve prisons. We resist the possibility of defunding the police, or better still, of completely reimagining the apparatus for achieving public safety where force is not the primary mechanism. We accommodate ourselves to a world in which fictions like race and gender, the binary construction of gender and class, the dividing practices that distribute power and privilege, we resist imagining a world in which those don't continue to exist or predict our life success, and we don't have any real way of imagining life outside of capitalism, even though we know that capitalism is the fuel for misogyny and racism and eco-destruction. So, we lack imagination, we are intransigent, and we have identities that have been based in injustice. The unjust systems, we accept them because we've found a way to be successful within them. And so we don't want to imagine who we would have to be if we dismantled those systems. William Bridges, author of a book called Transitions, says that the first movement in every major transition is loss. What is it that we have to lose? What is it that we have to give up in order to move towards a world where justice interventions become obviated because harm has been prevented? We have to be able to articulate some kind of imagination. And so, just as a place to begin, I want to offer mine. I'm not saying that my imagination about this is right, that it's complete, that it's exhaustive, but it's where I like to enter into the conversation, and I want to invite you into the conversation about reimagining justice. I imagine, and therefore I stand for, a world that works for everyone and everything, with no one and no thing left out, where all life has access to the relationships, resources, structures, and testimonial authority that they need to survive, to thrive, and to manifest their full capabilities, and to be able to contribute to a greater good. Say it again because it's a little. I imagine, and therefore I stand for a world that works, and a world that works for everyone and everything. No one, nothing left out. Where all life has access, fundamentally equitable access to the relationships, resources, structure, testimonial authority that it needs to survive, to thrive, to manifest full capabilities and be able to contribute to a greater good. That's where I want to enter into a conversation about reimagining justice, reimagining a world in which justice interventions become obviated. I wonder what your imagination is, and I'm willing to engage in conversation with you about that. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we'll be taking questions from the people in person, and Anna's going to be texting us if we have some virtual questions. So if anybody has a question or something they want to ask Dr. Hooker, just feel free, raise your hand, and we'll bring you the mic.
Questions, comments, concerns? None. Huh. I like it. Okay.
So like kind of jumping off of the way that you frame things, I'm wondering how you think, like my research and what I presented on earlier was about expressive arts and trauma healing.
Say again, it's about?
Expressive arts and trauma healing. So I would like to get your input on how you see the arts as part of the imagination.
The arts as part of imagination. So I think art is a central component to it because there are three ways in which art contributes to imagining this future. One is that certain kinds of art, visual art, auditory art, even movement, embodiment, don't require that you conform to the current status and structure. You can imagine a world, you can project through art ways that violate current kind of standards or narratives, which allows people to see something different. The other thing that art does is it offers counter narratives that then can be carried multiple generations. And so particularly I love theater because there are certain kinds of narratives that get embedded in theater and they get replayed in theater and movies and so forth, but the narrative itself becomes central because it resonates with who we are. And the third place that art shows up for me is in like science fiction and futurism, Afrofuturism, Palestinian futurism and those kinds of things. Because, I don't know, so there wasn't, for the longest time, black folks weren't projected into the future. There were no black folks going into the future. When they finally decided to allow an African American to go into the future, they sent Billy D. Williams. Star Wars, Lando Calrissian, right? Y'all don't remember this, but the first black person to be projected, and Billy D. had come out of a particular genre, so he had been in all of the black exploitation flicks, smooth, smooth talking, ladies' man, that kind of thing. So people could only imagine that. When they did, the next time they imagined black folks into the future, they imagined a brother from another planet. Broke down, ragged clothes, can't speak the language. They figured even in the future, African Americans were going to be ragged and unprepared and poor. It wasn't until somebody decided to produce Black Panther that we had the possibility of black excellence in the future. That's the value of art, is it can craft a thing that other people can see it as well. Because not everybody could see it. And they didn't notice that they weren't seeing it until they saw it so starkly in this other form. And so art has a tremendous contribution to make. Yeah. And then we'll go up there. Yeah.
Hi, so good to have you back with us, Dr.
Thank you.
Hooker. So I'm really interested in language, and I really liked what you were saying about justice being an ineffective signifier. And I'm wondering if you think we should be looking to other languages for perhaps more effective terminology or more effective signifiers when we talk about this, or is it just inherently a concept that is doomed to sort of have that issue with it?
I actually think so. This is a shameless plug, but in an article Mara Schiff and I co-authored, a special edition of Contemporary Justice Review, we are specifically asking to find language that creates a new domain for action, because justice is so burdened with the historical notions of oppression and repression and the prioritizing of property over people. And so we absolutely think that in order to move beyond, we're going to have to find a new domain of language. We don't know that it currently exists. And there are some other places to look. Like there's a way that you can look inside of what public health does, to imagine, and there are some other places to look and imagine, but I think we do have to come up with all new language. And people say, well, you can't come up with new language because language isn't something that you just invent. And I said, well, I don't know, Google it, to see if we can come up with something else. And then when you've Googled it and figured out that we can't, send me a tweet, because I just have to believe that there's a whole nother way of thinking and imagining, and then we just attach language to the new thing that we're trying to do. So absolutely. There's language. And because language distributes power and authority, we're going to have to come up with new words. People in the DSM, I don't know if any of you know this whole psychology thing, in DSM, since DSM-1 and until DSM-5R, neologisms, the process of creating new words, was considered a psychopathology. But it turns out in a lot of neighborhoods, in a lot of communities, because they know that the way people talk doesn't really provide the space or the power for them to fully flourish, they create new words. We create new words all the time and call ourselves and speak inside of other languages, and people say, they don't even know how to talk. Yes, they do. Trust me. I can't understand them. That's part of the process. You can't understand them until you get into their linguistic sphere. So absolutely, language is necessary.
I'm slightly afraid to ask this question, and if you don't want to answer it, that's perfectly fine.
I'm generally not scared. I don't mind.
But if you were to imagine a Catholic university in a place where it snows a lot, and you were to recommend what to do to make it a better place for African American individuals, what would you say?
This is the pinnacle of Catholic education, right? In the United States, this campus is the pinnacle of Catholic education. So most people who come here, particularly African Americans who have come through Catholic schools, have gotten so adjusted to the constraints of Catholic kind of school programming that they would be surprised, they would be almost, out of place if you actually shift it. That's the first thing. Carter Woodson says, if you control a person's mind, you don't have to control their body. If there is no back door, give them time, they will make one for their own convenience. And so how do we make it better? It's going to be disruptive to everybody to make it better. And there are a lot of, the Catholic cardinals, the bishops have a whole conference on the place where Catholic theology has contributed to racism and oppression. To really do the work, you have to do the dirt work. It's not structure work. It's the dirt work. It's in the narrative, which means how do we undo all of those little threads where the doctrine of discovery still gives permission to define certain ones as native, as property, as other, right? There's still a lot of that embedded in our policies and procedures and practices. It's in our art. It's in so many other places. So find somebody who doesn't know anything about Catholicism and walk them around campus and watch their eyes and ears as they get surprised by some of the artwork, some of the structures, some of the nomenclature that's used. Okay, this has nothing to do with any of that. And I'll tell you anyway. It's about symbolism. When I first came to Notre Dame as faculty, we had an orientation, and part of the orientation is they teach non-Catholic faculty how to do Mass so you can participate, so you can belong, right? And if you're not taking communion, if you're not receiving communion, we place it on you. We say, you're not receiving communion. Actually, communion is not accessible to you unless you have adopted our particular creed. But if that's the case, then when you approach the priest who's presiding, you should do this, and they will touch you. Their hand will hover above your head, and they'll say, bless you, right? The symbol for uncleanliness, tome. They won't touch you, they'll bless you. So you're supposed to do that as part of your participation in our Mass. Really? Really? But most folks won't notice it. It's not problematic unless you've got a theology. So in order to make most oppressions are based on the same logic as the logic of anti-blackness. And so once we start breaking open and making the space available and making it more amenable to full flourishing for black folks, we got to make it more amenable and more for full flourishing of Latino and the indigenous folks who are supposed to be able to come here, and gender nonconforming people and all of that kind of stuff, because it's all based on the same logic of anti-blackness, and that's all embedded deeply in the myths and metaphors that make up Catholic theology. It's not a short-term work. It's not an easy work. A whole bunch of people are going to be sacrificed to the work, but it's worth the struggle.
That story you told of the journalist who followed the labor from Guantanamo to the south side of Chicago, it represents sort of the fundamental connection to the violence that visited upon black and poor folk all across our country here, and what we project, the violence we project outside collapses the foreign and domestic. And I was just wondering, you sit on the board of this effort to transform that event, to move from justice to community. And I wonder if you think, or what you think about the idea of that being a feedback loop to transform in Guantanamo or transform in the military.
Yeah, it is not, transforming that part is not a priority, but it's part of the work. I mean, it's definitely a place, there's a place where that can happen. Transforming the military is not necessarily where we want to put our priorities, because
Not show, but as a model.
Oh, as a model, absolutely. As a model, absolutely, because it's shifting the narratives. We have to start noticing what narratives make sense, and then how do we shift those. What we've been doing is trying to connect internationally to other centers that where torture has been used as a part of political discourse or war, and figure out how we can build politicized healing in an international network. And so that's where we've spent, that's where we're spending a lot of our time right now, and trying to define this notion of politicized grieving. Like, politicized healing is one thing, but grief and lament are so important as part of a process. And so how do you create space for grief and lament? And I do think, even as I'm riffing on it right now, that once we start getting to grief and lament, the military, and particularly places like Guantanamo, are a deep seat of grief and lament. They have to lack transparency, because if they become transparent, even people who affirm the primary work of the military have to grieve the loss of humanity, both of the people who have been captured and those who have to do the work when they've captured them, right? And so there is a deep mutual reciprocal loss of humanity, and so I believe that there's a place for politicized healing in that as well. Yeah. So.
We actually have a virtual question. It's a bit of a longer one, so I'll just read it. Would you be able to share your thoughts, please, on how to best revisit a new form of peace as social justice in societies which experience peace process fatigue?
I'm losing you. You're coming in and out.
Okay.
Down and come up.
Yeah. Oh, I'll just speak louder. Okay. Would you be able to share your thoughts, please, on how to best revisit a new form of peace as social justice in societies which experience peace process fatigue? And then they gave the definition, which is peace has been implemented via an agreement and long established in a certain rigidly defined form, and which has resulted in grassroots cynicism of peace as social justice.
Yeah. So again, I think that peace probably is an equally ineffective signifier with justice. People don't agree on it. There are all these different kind of forms and thinking about what peace is. And so it's grasping at fog if we can talk about peace and we can't really fully get it, and we talk about social justice and we can't really fully get it. And you notice like justice, social justice, gender justice, racial justice, it's though they're pointing to the same thing when they're probably not. People aren't thinking about them as the same thing. And so as opposed to, I'm more inclined to imagine something different as opposed to rehabilitating the thing itself. So what is it that we could be building? Try this question. What's possible, for people who are pursuing justice, what's possible in the presence of justice that's not possible otherwise, right? What's possible in the presence of peace that's not possible otherwise? Because if we can say the thing that's possible, the thing that we're trying to make possible, then we use, you all remember the associative properties of mathematics. 6 equals, 4 plus 2. If we can say what becomes possible, we no longer have to talk about 6, which everybody doesn't agree on, but we can get micro, and we can talk about the 4 plus 2 that we're trying to make manifest. And I think that's what we're going to have to do with peace processes as well, is what is it that we were trying to make manifest? A lot of peace processes were trying to trade justice for harmony, and they call it peace, and we have to undo that paradigm and figure out what the thing is that we're actually trying to produce, and then speak more specifically about that. And so in the same way that we're trying to speak more specifically about justice, the thing that it produces, that it makes possible, we're going to have to think about that in terms of peace as well.
Do we have more questions from anybody?
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Oh.
We have one.
Sorry, I was still kind of like phrasing the question, but I found your talk really interesting, because I think about what kind of strategies do you engage when you talk to like communities or Native and Indigenous people or like Black people when for example, sometimes because of how we've been all kind of like colonized our minds. We keep on thinking that all we can do is do the low-hanging fruit, like just the symbols. Can we have certain things? And how do you work with communities and also help them kind of demand for more when even the less is being kind of not allowed for them to be, is not being given to them? So how do you sustain that?
So there's a process for narrative mapping, because we're not going to change the world by just changing systems and structures. Understanding systems and structures don't change anything unless it's accompanied by a change in the narrative that give those systems and structures sense. And so we do narrative mapping. We try to uncover together what are the problem narratives and what are the narratives of possibility. And then you go about the process of asking what needs to happen in order to make this narrative of possibility a habit. The relationships, resources, structure, testimonial authority, all of that, we're creating new habits inside of this preferred narrative. And what that does is it begins to do, it bumps up against some of the myths and metaphors that people are operating in. Every time people say they should do something or they shouldn't do something, they're talking about a narrative and not what their constraints actually are. So we want to investigate those narratives, reshape the narratives to be able to move forward. As kind of a concrete example, in Greensboro, after the massacre in 1985 and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was some good work done through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then we were trying to figure out what's the longer, more sustainable thing. And so we pulled a bunch of people together to ask the question, how do we create a Greensboro in which everybody experiences themselves as safe, protected, respected? That's what we were trying to do. Instead of justice, instead of peace, everybody wants to experience themselves as safe, protected, respected. Now we can have the police, we can have Black Lives Matter, the Latin Kings and Queens, the city council, other folks, all committed to naming the times when they are feeling safe, protected, and respected, the times when they're not, and see what's underneath that. And then figure out what do we have to do to make the underlying features that make safe, protection, and respected possible how do we make that the more dominant experience in a community? And so it's the undoing, it's the narrative work, it's the dirt work that gives you a longer term platform. And then if you can find a way, follow Paulo Freire, follow Augusto Boal, find a way to put those questions into theater form and allow people to engage, allow them to become spect actors where they are acting in the questions and acting into the answers, then I think you've got something. And every community, every culture has its own form of theater and music and storytelling. And so you can draw from the myths and metaphors and symbolism and rituals of that community to do the work in a way that deeply embeds it in their own experience. So, yeah.
We have
All right.
another question.
Oh, we do?
A virtual one. Yeah, it just
okay.
came in. This person said, towards the end of your talk, you shared your own vision for reimagining justice. They're wondering if you can share another reimagination, possibly said by somebody else, that you find inspiring.
Another,
So I guess I think they're asking for another form. Like, is that the only form you see of reimagination? Or is
No.
there another person you inspire that has made that image?
well, like I said, mine isn't complete. It's not necessarily like the truth. It's not necessarily like it's even right. It's just the way that I organize my life. And what it allows me to do, what my form allows me to do, is to look for certain places to take action. If everyone should have the relationships, resources, structure, testimonial authority, survive, thrive, manifest their full capabilities, then I can look at each one of those. Each of those are parts of the work, right? So I can pay attention to that. I mean, there are a number of framings of justice that are given. Some come out of different faith traditions, some come out of different philosophical traditions or wisdom traditions of sort. There are a number of ways that people talk about it in different cultural contexts, and so I think that mine aligns with. I'm not arguing for it, but I think that there are also plenty, depending on the place where they're asking from. I'm certain that there are reimaginations and conversations and counter narratives about the possibility of justice in that cultural context as well. And so I would just invite them to consider their own wisdom traditions and cultural context to search for it. And then feel free to share with me what they found, because it's a conversation. So, yeah. Perfect. Thank you all for having me back. Lovely to see you. Enjoy the Peace Conference. Be well. Yeah.